Hi, everybody, and welcome to another Women in Sales webinar series. Although it is the Women in Sales webinar series, we have lots of gentlemen who join us from the sales community as well, and I'm psyched about that. So thank you all for joining. I'm Barbara Giamanco. I'm the CEO of Social Centered Selling, the host of the Conversations with Women in Sales podcast, and the founder of the Women in Sales Hub. And one of the things that we try to do with the Women in Sales Hub community is to provide a lot of complementary educational content like the webinar we're going to deliver for you today to help you be the best version of yourself as a seller. Now, I'm super excited about this. My speaker today is Dana Dupuis. She is the founder at Listening Intelligence. I've had the pleasure of talking with Dana on the podcast. I think she may mention some of that during her session. But we're going to talk about listening. Listening is the secret weapon. You might think that's a little bit odd, but here's the reality. Often salespeople, whether they realize it or not, either because they're new, they're nervous, they lack training, sometimes they talk more than they're actually listening. As you'll hear from Dana, listening and hearing are not the same things. So I'm super psyched for this session. Again, feel free to chat those questions in along the way. I'm going to be paying attention and watching for those. With that, enough from me. Dana, welcome. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Barb. It's nice to be here. Welcome, everyone. As Barb said today, we're going to look at listening as a secret weapon for sales. And I think you'll be interested to see that we're going to look at listening from a very different angle. Some of the things that we'll cover today is how we really listen. We hear with our ears, but we actually listen with our brains. So the sound comes through our ears, but how we recognize the information that actually happens in our brain. We're going to look at there are 4 ways we listen, or 4 habits in our listening. We're going to have you look at your own listening and try and self-identify how you listen. Then we're going to give you clues as to how to recognize the listening of your buyers and your prospects. So that's probably the real meat of today. And then we're going to look at what next. And when I say what next, we have a small offer for everyone that will allow you to come and take what we call our Listening Intelligence Assessment. So some of you might have joined us a few weeks ago when we did a podcast in Women in Sales. And the information that we covered is some of the foundational information that's important to understand about how we look at listening. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to actually go back and review a few of the very main points that we covered in the podcast. But believe me, we'll get through that very quickly and we'll move on to some new stuff. So if you were with us last time, stay connected because we'll get into some new things. Yeah, there we go. My slides were getting stuck a little bit. So one of the first things we like to look at in listening is how it really works. Research has told us that we do hear with our brain, we hear with our ears, we listen with our brain, and we know that no 2 brains are alike, therefore no 2 individuals really listen quite the same. We all pick up or listen to and for different kinds of information. So where you might have seen this happen in the past or in the future is when you're in a meeting, maybe a sales meeting, and you're hearing relevant information that is related to the product or service that you're selling, and everyone sort of picks up different information related to that conversation. And so what happens a lot of times is we'll say, geez, 8 people attended the meeting and 8 people came out with a slightly different understanding of what that information was all about. And so this is because no 2 brains are alike, therefore as the information is being received, it's being picked up differently. So that's the first foundational pillar to how we look at listening. It's a brain-based function and no 2 brains are alike. The second thing I'd like to talk about, and there we go, is that listening is a habit. So I'm going to have an exercise for everyone, and I know I can't see you, so I'm hoping that you'll join in on this silly little exercise. When we look at a habit in this cognitive function, we know that you can measure it. And so what we say is that a habit is a routine or a behavior that you've really just grown accustomed to, and you've repeated it over and over, and somehow it's been valuable to you. So what I'd like everyone to do is move away from their desk just slightly and put their arms down next to them. And without thinking about it, just cross your arms. And now that your arms are crossed, look down and see which arm is on the top of the crossing. And make note of it, and then just uncross your arms, take a moment, and then quickly try to recross them the opposite way. And notice you kind of have to be intentional about it. And then drop them again, quickly refold them the opposite way again. Now that's a habit. You know, however you cross your arms, most likely you've crossed them the exact same way forever. And it's a little nerve-wracking, and a little bit of intention has to be focused on trying to cross them the opposite way. We say the same thing about our listening. So when we go into meetings, when we meet with prospects, when we listen in any aspect of work, we have habits that we rely on. And you'll see how that's going to show up in a few moments when we look at the 4 different ways that we listen. So one of the things I'd like to talk about in both listening and in habits is something that is around how many assessments are in the world. So we have decided to build an assessment around how people listen because we knew there was something to this. We felt like there was not only in people's communication did they speak a certain way, but they listened a certain way. And so what we wanted to do is build an assessment that showed people what they listened to and for. And when we moved into the assessment world, here's what we learned. There are approximately 6,000 assessments in the business world, and they break down into 3 categories. And why is that important? Because many of them you've probably had experiences with in the past. Maybe Myers-Briggs, maybe DISC, maybe social styles, maybe Herman Brain Instrument, excuse me. But what we like to talk about is in the assessment world, there are 3 different kinds of assessments. Some fall into the personality assessment area, some fall into the behavioral area, and some fall into the cognitive area. What I want to do is tie this back to habits, because our personality and our behavior are hardwired to us. So that means regardless of what job you go into or what experience or situation you are in, your personality and your behavior are hardwired, and they will continue to be who you are. What we've learned about cognitive assessments, cognitive behaviors, if you will, such as listening, is something that does shift both within which people you're speaking to, what circumstances you are in, or if you changed jobs. For instance, if you were, say, an accountant and you lived for facts and figures, and then you moved into a sales role because you really wanted to get connected to people, what you listen to and for, because it's a behavior, is going to change because your experience changed. So the reason that I talk about that is if we know, as we said here, that listening is a habit, why it's important to align it with these assessments is you might have in your career thus far done a personality or a behavioral assessment. They are all fantastic. The thing that we like to talk about, though, is that listening is different, and you can layer these assessments on top of each other. So just a little information regarding assessments and the landscape of them. But let's get back to the subject at hand, which is listening and how it's going to help you as a salesperson. So first of all, what I'd like to do is show you how we describe the 4 ways that individuals listen. We call it connective, reflective, analytical, and conceptual. And so what I'd like everyone to do that's interested in joining in is to write down these 4 habits: connective, reflective, analytical, and conceptual. And what I'm going to do is give you a high-level overview of each of these 4 habits and how they show up. And I'd like you at the end of the 4 habits to self-diagnose what you think your listening profile might look like. Now, just to fast forward, at the end of our time together, we're going to give you a link and allow you to take our assessment that's online. And the fun part of doing it here on your own is you can see how closely you diagnose yourself in your listening compared to once at the end, if you go and do the assessment online, how closely those match. So I'm just going to give you a moment to find a piece of paper, a pen, and we will get started. So the first type of listening that I would like to share with you is something we call connective listening. So what the listener tends to do with connective listening is they focus on what the information that they're hearing or the interaction that they're in means to others. We call it external listening. They listen to how information will affect others. On the strength side, this type of listening provides support and empathy for others, and it appreciates the broad application of information to teams and individuals outside of themselves. This kind of listening hears the feelings behind the facts and orients themselves towards others. How might they help others? As far as challenges that this type of listening has is they simply accept information at face value. So a lot of times someone with high connective listening can say something like, let's go along with Barb's idea because I really like Barb. So they get very co-opted and connected to others. They may forget to look inward and know, as if they have high connective listening, what they already know about this subject matter because they're so focused on how it is affecting others. They might sacrifice facts and data for feelings and how this information is affecting others. And they are often ruled by emotions. So connective listening can be ruled by emotions. So I'm going to take a moment and just let everybody sink into that a little bit and think to yourself, how much of this type of connective listening do you have in the way you listen? And I'm going to give you a small example of how a connective listening dominant person might show up in a meeting. So they would be leaning forward, making eye contact with the speaker, nodding their head, looking around the room to see how others are taking in the information, and they would be taking care of both the speaker and others in the room to make sure that people were getting what they needed. So that is connective listening. Let's move on to number 2, which is reflective listening. When we say that reflective listening really focuses on what the interaction means to the person that is dominant in this habit. They filter what they hear through their own interests and purposes. Some of their strengths are they can evaluate the direct application of information and how it relates to them or their goals. They have a library of experiences that they can relate back to internally to say, as they're hearing information, will this work or will this not work? Quite often we see them as individual contributors because they are very much an internal listener. So highly reflective dominant listeners will go inside and think through the information that they're hearing and almost check out from the conversation because they are doing some fact checking and making sure that what they're hearing is consistent with what they need. Let's look at some of the challenges that reflective listening brings. Quite often they can, reflective listening can miss the whole potential of the application if it does not relate to them. They can be overly introspective with their thinking and ignore the meaning for others, as well as miss the usefulness of the information related to, say, a strategy for a company if it does not relate to them. Let me give you an example of how they might show up in a meeting. Someone with high reflective listening in a meeting can often push themselves away from the table just slightly, tilt their body, and look up as if they're looking into their own head and act as if, or appear as if they are totally checked out, when in fact they are actually very connected to the information and working through it. So their body language looks very different than what's actually happening with them. Once again, take a moment, think about this type of listening, and see how connected that feels to the way you listen. Now we're going to move on to the third type of listening of the 4 habits. The third type of listening we call analytical. This one's pretty straightforward. It focuses on the interaction and what it means related to an issue or an objective or a goal. For strengths, what we notice is this type of listening discerns accuracy of information and critiques the information directly towards an outcome. This type of listener, if someone is highly analytical in their listening, they will listen for the facts behind the feelings. So they'll look to find the facts. And they control their biases and their opinions very well. They really are just spreadsheet-oriented, budget-oriented, resource-oriented, and live in the structure of facts and figures. On the challenges side of this kind of listening, what we see is an analytical dominant listener needs to get things right. This kind of listening discards information that could be valuable, so they are not concerned about how a new initiative might fall on others, how it would affect others' ability to manage a new initiative. And they can shut off complete interactions with others if the interaction is not based in facts. At a meeting, you will see someone who is dominant in analytical listening, easy for me to say. They will be very quiet in their body language. They might have their hand holding their head and just looking down at their work. They might even pull their laptop out and do work in the middle of a meeting because they want to get things done until the spreadsheet conversation comes in, and then they might pop back into the conversation. So that's analytical. I'll give you a moment once again to think about how much of that type of listening shows up in how you perceive your own listening. So let's look at the 4th listening habit called conceptual listening. This one's straightforward also. This type of listening focuses on the big picture and ideas, often abstract, and they filter what is heard through the interests in concepts and possibilities. So for strengths, what we see in listening 2 and 4, strengths concepts and possibilities, is there's an ability to comprehend broad views and lots of information. They use information to stimulate ideas and connect ideas to other ideas through patterning. And they can, conceptual dominant listeners can really understand multiple meanings of one message. They really live in possibility and think towards the future. How might this work? On the challenges side, this type of listening can really miss the trees in the forest, the details, how we might get there. They can lack the focus on the present and may read more into a situation than was really meant. When we have highly conceptual listeners in meetings, what we'll see is they are fidgety. They'll tap their toes, their hands. They'll walk in the back of the room. Sometimes they don't like to sit down. They'll look right through you or to the side of you as if they're looking into the future. And yeah, so those are the 4 ways that we have researched and looked at listening. Now, what I'd like to do is have everyone take a moment, think about the 4 habits, and chat in and let us know if you have one dominant habit, what it is, or if you're finding you have a tie in ranking just when you're thinking through this of what the couple or even 3 different types of listening that you see as your dominant listening habits. And Barb, share with me what you're seeing as they come in.
I will definitely do that for you, Dana. And I also am going to have a question or 2 to queue up for you based on what we just talked about. So I'm going to give everybody just a quick second. Go ahead and consider the 4 habits that Dana has just talked about: the connective listening, the reflective listening, analytical, and conceptual. Go ahead and chat in which one you think is the most dominant, and maybe you think 1 or 2 of those, or possibly even 3, rank fairly close together. So let's hear it. I've heard from one Dana. We've got at least 1 connective in the group besides myself. I think you're going to talk about my my habit in just a minute. We've got an analytical/connective. We have a conceptual who has chatted in. All right, we've got 1 person on the line who is saying it's definitely a toss-up, depending on who I'm talking to, between connective and analytical. Interesting, 2 so far. We've got another conceptual, highly conceptual, along with connective, 0 analytical, 0 in capital letters, I might add. And then oh, someone has said apparently they're triple dominant because they already did the assessment. All right, share. What are the 3? What are the 3? Let's hear it for the triple dominance there. Want to hear it. Okay, good. So if you want to keep chatting in what your styles are, that's great. Now, these are predominantly salespeople. We also have a few people on the line who I know are entrepreneurs, Dana, running their own businesses. And so do you think there's any correlation? I'm just kind of curious as I'm watching. We've got another connective, conceptual. So we have some similarities with a couple who have analytical mixed in there as well. I think you're going to talk about my style. I have analytical. It's certainly the lowest ranked of the 4. Do you think there's a correlation between the listening styles and people who tend to go into sales, or is this just kind of coincidence?
You know, we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but I will highlight it in the moment right now, and that is that we do see some patterning in it. It's interesting because listening is a habit. What we see is that whatever has served you in the past is what you will bring to the future. But then sometimes what you see very quickly is that doesn't serve you well, and you just naturally start to shift. What we're really out to do, Barb, is prepare for any high stakes meetings with clients, with prospective clients, and bring the right kind of listening and prep to move. So when I say that you do see some assumptions, like let's just say we're going to go work with an accounting firm. What we've noticed is accountants love numbers. So there's quite a good chance that their analytical listening will be high in the firm. We actually had a certified practitioner recently work with a team of actuaries, and the high level of analytical listening in the room was off the charts. Now, we work out of Echo, we work with a local marketing firm. And so there are 23 people on a team that are constantly developing ideas, so they have very high conceptual listening in that firm. And then we do quite a bit of work in the service industry, hospitality industry, and what we'll see is highly connective listening. And those are all assumptions because that doesn't mean that everybody in those different industries will fall into those categories, but we do see quite a bit of that kind of relationship to listening. But you'll notice I didn't talk about reflective listening in any of those three industries because we find reflective listening in all places. The thing that reflective listening does tend to show up as is, like I said earlier a little bit, in individual contributions. A highly dominant reflective listener will tend to work less on teams because they have more of an inner type of focus. And one thing I like to mention about dominant reflective listeners is although they are focused on what's important to them, they are not egotistical, they are not self-centered, it's just the way they listen. So if you go way back to one of the first slides I shared about assessments, if we look at behavioral assessments, they show you how people behave. Listening can be associated with the way people behave, but it's not always. So you could have a highly connective listener who really thinks about what information means to others, but they could be quiet. So behavior and listening have some crossover, but it isn't consistent all the time. So you have to really hold your assumptions lightly.
Excellent. Well, and also a point that you just made, which I think is important, none of the four are good or bad, right? There's no judgment. This is just sort of how we're wired. As you said, listening is all about the brain, and this is how we're wired, and this is what we do. Before you move on, do we want to have some fun with Barb as the guinea pig and maybe talk a little bit about my styles and maybe what that means for me as a salesperson? Because I do have a couple of other questions. I think you might cover them though. But one of the things that I think is important is as we start to understand our own style and we start to get an understanding of maybe the buyers we're interacting with, their styles are like, we need to adapt and adjust and maybe think about reframing our questions or perhaps not sharing as much information or maybe sharing more information if we need to. So use me.
I will.
What does my profile say about Barb?
I will. So we are going exactly where you just talked about. We're going to look at how to recognize the listening habits of others. But we'll start with Barb here. Barb is what we would call the pace setter. Now, when you have a chance to take Echo, you'll realize that there are 41 different profiles. That means these 4 habits can be put together in 41 different ways. So you can be dominant in one, you can have a dual dominant, a triple dominant, or what we call a non-dominant flexor for a listening habit or profile. So Barb is a pace setter. Her profile is triple dominant, so she's highly connective, she's highly reflective, and she's highly conceptual. So how we say that shows up is she's a mover. She wants to get stuff done. She wants to know she can ideate very well in this conceptual field, but she's got this great library of experiences, so she'll quickly, in ideation, know from her past what will work, what won't. She can push through the minutia of ideas that are being thrown out and think through 2 lenses. 1, what will work, what won't from my past, and 2, how will this land on others? So if you look at what she's decided to do for work is to build this whole series that speaks to the needs of other women. That's the connective piece. Through podcasts, through these webinars, through different channels, she's looked at all different ideas of how to get the most that she knows that has worked for herself and others and get it out through these different channels. And so I would say, Barb, the work you do shows up quite well in your listening habit. Her analytical listening is not extremely low. It's just that these three are so strong that that's how she blends her listening through these three lenses. And then afterwards takes a pause and then thinks about, okay, do I have budget for this? Do I have the timeline? When do I need to get this done? So it's actually utilized. It's just not in the forefront of your listening as much as the other three.
Well, and I mean, this was spot on for sure. Fit me to a T. The analytical, as you said, it's not as high as the others, but it's fairly high. I think it was 18 out of the total scale, which means that I can do analytical when I need to. I am not the person to live in spreadsheets. That's not my thing. And I'll share this brief story before I let you go on with the rest of the presentation, Dana. I want to share with everybody that through the years, before we had these kinds of opportunities to take assessments like echo listening, I learned by trial and error, and you don't have to, but I thought back a long, long time ago in a land far, far away of a major deal that I lost. And afterward, after really thinking about it, I understood what happened was the person on the other side was very much from a listening and personality type, really had that analytical bent. And I come in with both the, connect and the conceptual, and I'm very outgoing and very positive, and hey, I'm going to get it done for you. And I also had not prepared enough with the detailed kinds of answers that this individual needed. Therefore, there wasn't a level of trust there. Now I understand why that really happened, and I figured that out a long time ago before the assessments came along. But I just wanted to share that story with you because then it made me realize the importance of thinking a lot about what does the other person need out of the conversation. If I'm in a sales call, what is it that that individual is really going to find most important? Because at the end of the day, and I'm sure you would agree, Dana, that's what counts. It's what the buyer finds important. And if you're able to adjust to what they need, I think you're going to find yourself a lot more successful in selling, which is, I'm just telling you right now because Dana's going to give you the opportunity to take the assessment. You are going to want to do that and really then take that learning and put it into practical application. And Dana, as I've told you before, since you gave me the gift of the assessment, I've done the same thing. I'm always constantly looking and making sure that I am clear on not only the strengths, but where I might have some unintended blind spots, if you will. So I appreciate you using me as the guinea pig. I'm cool with that, but I want people to understand that this can really help you figure out yourself and then help you adapt to other people, because that's really the point in selling.
Yeah, and Barb, I mean, if you had to go into a budget meeting with a prospective client and it was high stakes and you prepped well, you could put questions in front of yourself that would make sure that what you listened for was related to analytical listening. I mean, we can all do it. We just don't naturally go there. So just by prepping ahead of time, you can really hone in on the type of listening you need for a certain situation.
And I might actually bring in another resource to support me. So a lot of people who are on the call, Dana, work in organizations where there are other people in the company, maybe in finance or operations or in other areas of the business. Maybe it's even their sales leader who, if you feel you need some additional support and you have that kind of opportunity inside your own company, I think you can take advantage of it. Even running my own business, I've been in a couple of big high-stakes customer situations where I've brought in business partners that I've worked with in the past who might have a strength that I don't, and then bring them as well. So even though I can prep for a lot of things, if I can also bring a resource to the table who's really got that strength, I have found that to be very helpful also.
Yes, and it's excellent advice. Excellent. Well, we're going to move on a little bit here and look at a little bit more information about listening. So we say we hear with our ears and we listen with our brains. What we also know is the way our brain works is how we listen informs how we think, because whatever we're focused on listening-wise is coming in, and then that's what our brain is focusing on, so it shows us how we think, and then it also shows us how we will speak. So when I talk about, we'll use Barb as an example. She just said she's the pace setter. She moves quickly. She's got high connective and high conceptual listening. Therefore, when she's speaking to a prospect in her natural state of being, guess what? She's going to chat up with them, maybe ideate a little bit, share with them her background. And so what's really important in your listening development is that you start with yourself and learn how you listen, because if you learn how you listen, you can start to understand how then you land on others as you share information. So if we look at this point number 2, our prospects may listen differently than we do, and so if they're picking up different kinds of information than what we're sharing with them, regardless of the importance of it, they're not going to get it the way you're hoping they will. So what we really want you to do in preparation is never change your content or your message as far as what you're trying to share. Just know your audience so that you change your delivery. And so we're going to look at that a little bit more. How do we recognize the listening habits of others? Well, it's not really that easy, and it's not extremely straightforward, but we look at a few different things. In the 4 primary habits, we look at, as a connective listener, or reflective, or analytical, or conceptual, what are the things that type of listening will pay attention to? What might they ignore? What questions will they ask? And how might their body language exhibit when they're listening? So I'm going to run through these quickly because you're all going to get this slide deck, and I want you to just get the overview of this and you can dive into it later. So we know connective listeners pay attention to what information means to others. What they ignore is how information might affect themselves. What questions might they ask? You can see them here. How will that impact my team? Where can others go to learn about this? And then their body language, they're going to look around to see how others are doing. They're going to nod their head. They're going to lean in. These are all ways that you can observe your prospective buyers and your clients and start to understand how their listening shows up. So that's dominant connective. Let's look at reflective, because it's going to look a little different. So they're going to think about how information affects them personally. They use a lot of I statements. I can do this. I had a situation like this. As a salesperson, people who use a lot of I statements, you can definitely expect them to have high reflective listening. They ignore how information affects others, and they ignore what others tell them because it is not in the purview of how they're listening. They ask questions about how they can use this, how will that impact them, how might that help their career. Their body language sometimes looks checked out, quite frankly. So it can also get impatient because once they think they've got the answer and they have it internally, they'll start to jitter and move like they want to share it and they want to move on. So especially, well, we're gonna look at some examples of how this plays out in a moment. If we look at analytical type of listening, what analytical listening pays attention to are facts, figures, timelines, spreadsheets. They're looking for the goal or the end in mind. Are the areas being shared fall within budget, or the information that's being shared fall within a budget, timeline, allocated resource type of conversations, because they're going to check out if the conversation is around how it makes people feel, how it might affect them. Questions they'll ask is, how will we use this? Will this get us to our goal? And then their body language, as we said, is very quiet. So once again, you can really observe this kind of information in your prospective buyers. If you don't know them well, you can really just watch and listen to the words they use, questions they ask. Now let's look at conceptual. They pay attention to new ideas, possibilities, patterns of information. They ignore, as we said, timelines, budgets, spreadsheet conversations. Questions they ask are quite often in the future and open-ended. Where else can we use this? What other options might there be? And then their body language, I think that gaze is something that really gives them away. They almost look like they're looking through you or into something that is not even something you can see. They're looking into the future. So those are ways that you can start to recognize how your audience is listening. I think there are a couple of things about this that are important. One is, as you saw in trying to self-diagnose, a lot of us are dual or triple dominant. So as you're observing your prospective client, they might show patterns of more than one type of listening, which is fine. So you may speak into that as you notice it. As we said before, hold your assumptions lightly, prep ahead. We suggest you prep ahead for all 4 kinds of listening. So regardless of what the situation is, if you are going into, say, a law firm, we would say there'll be high analytical listening most likely, so you can hold that assumption lightly. But in your preparation, make sure you have statistics, facts, figures. And then here's a little trick that we do. We say share a story that would connect with Connective, but with statistics that will hold and build credibility with your analytical listeners. So how does this play out? Let's just say the woman in the top left corner of this picture is selling to this group of individuals. And she knows ahead of time that they are in the hospitality industry and they own a chain of small boutique hotels. I'd like you to chat in, what kind of listening would we consider to be at the top of or the most dominant in a group of hospitality hotel owners? So Barb, just tell me what people are chatting in. Chat in what you think that might be the most dominant type of listening that she will see. Are you getting anything? Huh. Well, I'm not hearing Barb, so I hope people are still hearing me. And I'm going to move on to say, I'm going to give you a second example, which looks a little different. And that would be, same picture, but what if this woman were talking to an oil and gas company and she was looking at where they might decide to drill next? What kind of listening would that type of audience show as their dominant listening? So as you can see, it's important that when you look at how this plays out, you don't want to change who you are. You don't want to change the content of what you are actually out to share. You just want to change the way you share it. And what's important to know is that if you listen in to and observe your audience, you can very quickly catch up and mimic and speak into, as we say, speak into their listening. So one thing I'd like to do is, I get this question all the time, okay, that sounds great, I can do this in person, I can watch their body language, I can understand some of the things that they'll say, but here's what we get asked a lot is, how does this show up over the phone? So given what we've observed thus far in thinking about the 4 habits, many of the same rules apply. What we're going to listen for is what seems to have the person on the other end of the phone's interest? Where do they ask questions? What are they ignoring? We can actually hone in a little bit more on their language on the phone. We have a tendency to listen to more of that. So connective listeners will hear a lot of we statements. How are we going to get this done? Now, what we'll also see is when you are speaking with a reflective listener, they'll say a lot of I statements. How will I get this done? If it's conceptual, we'll see that they're going to ask a lot about what other kinds of ideas might we use? What other thinking do you have around this problem to solve it? And then lastly, analytical. I went out of order, but analytical, they'll talk about what are the statistics telling us and what proof do we have. So languaging can really show up in the 4 habits. And on the phone, believe it or not, because there are so many less distractions, we almost notice that we can pick up the person on the other end of the phone, what their dominant listening habits are quicker because of the fact that you don't have other distractions. So what I'd like to do is move over to an offer we have. And I'm not sure, I can't hear Barb, so I'm not sure if Barb, are you still with us?
I'm still here, absolutely.
Oh, good.
Yeah, yeah, that's okay. I've been chatting with everyone and watching how they are getting a great grasp, I think, on the different habits as you've been applying those to the different sales scenarios that you were just talking about. I think before you talk about the assessment, if you don't mind, there was one question that came up that I wanted to make sure that I asked you to cover, if that's okay.
I would love that.
All right, that's great. So knowing that, and you said this right in the very beginning, you said, 8 different people can be in a room and they're all going to hear something a little bit different. I've certainly experienced that as a sales manager. I've certainly experienced that in other situations in groups where I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I'm perfectly clear. And then all of a sudden 5 out of the 8 heard something like totally outside my personal bubble. And I'm like, what? How did that happen? So, whether it's an individual on a sales call, which you've talked about a little bit, what about sales leaders? We have some sales leaders on the line as well. So what about sales leaders? Once they know that they're going to have people in their teams that have these different styles or habits, any tips for them to be sure they're drawing people into the conversation, knowing what they know about listening?
Yeah, well, Barb, do you remember when we started, you said, hey, make sure you give a little bit of your background, and because I'm not going to introduce you, make sure you jump in and give a little bit of your background.
That's right.
So the funny thing is, I was VP of sales or director of sales for 5 different companies. That was my career prior to getting into listening, and exactly what you were speaking about is what first spurred my interest in listening, because as a sales manager, I always had a group of individuals who approached all of the selling in very different ways. So we'd have a structure to sell, but people would go about it in their own way. And what I noticed is not only did they speak differently, each of them, but they heard how we approached it in a different manner. And the way that we looked at success in all 5 of these companies was to have the individual be successful and worked individually with each of the sales people because of the way that they showed up in both their speaking and listening. So when you ask how does that happen, there are 2 things that are going on. One is the sales manager has their own way of approaching their listening and speaking, and then their team individuals are doing the same. So the way that we saw it play out is the more the sales manager is really connected to and understanding how they are contributing and how they are listening, then they can shift that to speak into the listening of the individual sales representative.
Excellent. Now, I know this is kind of a strange question, and you're fine not to answer it. But all of a sudden, I just sort of wondered, as we think about a lot of the initial sales interactions, Dana, people are doing their outbound sales calling and outbound outreach through email. I know this is going to sound really odd, but the way that we tend to listen or share information, does that also sort of translate into how we might write an email to someone? I know that sounds like it's kind of off the wall. I was just curious.
No, it's exactly right.
Oh, okay.
It's exactly right. How we communicate is how we communicate. So if you have a highly analytical individual that you have on your team, they, in speaking to them, are much less interested in how your weekend was, how the kids are, and want to get to what do you need from them. They might finish a statement with that, but they're going to write the same way. If they are writing you a text or an email, or if they're on Slack, they're going to write you exactly what they need with no, hey, how's it going? And it can be offensive. However, they mean nothing by it. So when people are communicating with you in all these different aspects of what this world is like now, really step back before you take offense or even wonder what their if there's an underlying message, and think about, oh, maybe they're analytical in their listening, or if they're ideating and brainstorming all over the place and you feel like, God, I just wish they'd get to the point, realize that they could just be listening for more ideas. So
Got it.
It is consistent. You will see. So you guys are getting a little taste of how I listen. I am what's called a non-dominant listener, and I bounce around. So I pick up little snippets of things, and then when I go to share it, unfortunately, the same thing happens. So when you're on the other side of the communication equation with me and you're listening to me, unless I'm very structured, I can be hard to follow. So because I'm bouncing around giving you little tidbits of things and they don't feel like they go together.
That's interesting, because I have talked with you a number of times now, and I never got that impression. So it may just be that because you know that about yourself, you adjust. Now, in the last few minutes that we have, let's go ahead and talk about that amazing offer that you have for the group, and then I'll take any final questions and wrap us up for today.
Okay. So I told you that my background was building sales teams. What ended up happening was we saw the importance of listening. We researched for a number of years and built this assessment. And what the assessment does is it allows you to answer 10 questions fairly quickly. They are forced choice, and it will give us a profile of how you listen. Now, I want to tell you something. Now that you've learned the backdrop, the 4 habits, how each of them works, when you read the questions, you're going to be able to really game, if you will, the system. So try to forget everything you learned here, and when you read those questions, answer them from your gut and put them in order of who you are, not who you want to be, and try to be honest with yourself, because most people take this assessment before they've learned everything that you've just learned, and so now it's sort of hard to unlearn all of that. But what you do is you go to this website that we have here, and you put this promo code in, Women in Sales, or WIS, listen, and answer the 10 questions, and automatically your results will come directly to you, and it's quite a rich report that will give you lots of fun information. And lastly, this is how you connect with me. And this is how you connect with Barb. And so please make sure that you tell us what you thought of this webinar, questions you might have, suggestions on how to make it better. I love all kinds of information. I also love to hear about listening challenges, so feel free. The best place to reach me is really through my email, but feel free to check out our website. There's lots of rich information there. We have a blog you can sign up for. And yeah, that's all I have, Barb.
Dana, that was fantastic, and I really want to thank you so much for joining me today. I'm going to give everybody's been pretty active on chat, actually, sending in comments and questions, and it's really exciting to see that so many of them from what you shared with us today so far, really getting a sense of how these habits kind of play into their own style and how that plays into the styles of others when they're making those sales calls. So don't forget to take Dana up on her offer to take the assessment. It's well worth investing the time. You're going to get back some rich data to really help you better perform as a sales professional, but also it helps you very much personally in your interpersonal communication with anyone. So be sure to take her up on that offer. I will be sending you a copy of the recording, the follow-up with the link to the offer that Dana mentioned and some other particulars and how you can connect with Dana. So I'm going to give you all just a few seconds. If you want to chat in another question or two, go ahead and let me know. So we'll hold for just a sec to see if any more questions come in. And if not, then we will wrap things up.
Hey, so Barb, while we're waiting, you being the pace setter, what I would think about in your profile is that, you know, from time to time you might have to just ask yourself to slow down and make sure that you're getting everything because you really like to move. Do you ever find that?
Oh my gosh, yes. And because I've also got the high reflective, and I've got the big picture brainstorming ideation strength that I've known for a long time, and then the reflective I'm thinking about and processing how does that apply to me. The one thing that jumped out at me was the word impatience. That is certainly something I've learned through the years because I always feel like I pick up on things fairly quickly, and so I'm always constantly monitoring myself, if you will, to make sure that I'm not going too fast, that I'm not assuming people are getting it as quickly as I am. More importantly, if they're not getting it as quickly, then I'm not making a judgment about that. And when I was younger and less experienced, I definitely tended to do that.
Well, very good. Thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely. Well, it looks like everybody is signing off. They've all said thank you, Dana. So I'm going to go ahead and say thank you to you for joining me today for this great session talking about listening and how important that is in terms of being successful in our roles as sales individual contributors and sales leaders. Really appreciate your time today. For everybody who has joined us, thank you so much. You can always go to the womeninsaleshub.com online community to see what other events we have coming up. Doing lots of events and webinars that are complimentary to you with great guests, just like Dana. And make sure you go and check out the Conversations with Women in Sales podcast interview I did with Dana. You can also find blog posts on the website as well as at barbaragiamanco.com. So with that, everybody have a great day. Happy selling. Thanks for joining. And until next time, see ya.